Hi, everyone. This is going to be a great panel. So we're going to discuss lessons learned from what happened with the user-activated soft fork and some of the other lessons that we have learned over the years as far as how to go about making some updates and changes to the code. And let's have the panelists introduce themselves. My name is Tone Vays, and I come from traditional finance, but I do have a master's in financial engineering, used to code a little bit, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very fascinated by all of this technology. So let's go ahead and have the panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm James Hilliard. I'm a software developer and author of the BIP91 soft fork. And I've done a lot of mining-related software development.
Hello. Hello. I'm Slush, and I am founder of Slush Pool, which was the first mining pool back in 2010, and co-founder of Trezor, which was the first hardware wallet back in 2013.
Hi, my name is Francis Pouliot. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Bull Bitcoin, which is a non-custodial Bitcoin-only Bitcoin payments and exchange service in Canada. And previously, I was running a Bitcoin help desk and physical kiosk called the Bitcoin Embassy in Montreal.
Hello, my name is John Carvalho. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at BitRefill. Some of you know me as Bitcoin Errorlog.
All right, so let's jump right into it and talk about how we got here. All of you were very heavily involved in 2017 when it was time to activating SegWit. And James, you played a very critical role by creating a BIP to make it happen. So just let's quickly review how that came about, because segregated witness was not supposed to be controversial. What made it controversial, and what were you doing to help mitigate the situation?
So I would say overall that SegWit itself, even among miners, it was not really all that controversial in and of itself, so much as some miners also wanted a hard fork block size increase at the same time, which is, for a number of reasons, much more difficult than a soft fork. Hard forks require, there's a lot more things that can go wrong essentially there.
Tell us about the BIP that you created and how that helped.
So BIP91, the main goal for it was essentially to offer an alternative to user-activated soft fork for the miners to run that would essentially accomplish the same end result. It was designed to activate before, assuming enough miners ran it quickly, before the user-activated soft fork date.
All right, and Slush, how did you guys see it from a security perspective and from a mining perspective, because you're involved on both sides? Were there risks, and why were you confident that going the user-activated soft fork route was the safest way at that point and needed to be done?
Well, user-activated soft fork was, you were asking for UASF, yeah, was the last resort of activating SegWit, I believe, after many months spending on alternative, more cleaner solutions, in my opinion. Yeah. So we originally didn't want to take any stance on this, because we try to give opportunity for miners to get to vote them for they what they wanted. So we introduced voting in blocks on Slush pool, but it ended up in some heavy politics. So we were in favor of UASF because we believe that SegWit is actually non-controversial and it was just misused for some political game. Yeah.
And Francis, you were putting together meetups, and I remember I've attended some, drove up to Canada, where trying to get more people to run nodes, signaling for the user-activated soft fork. How did you see that going down, and did the whole activation of SegWit like catch you by surprise? It wasn't supposed to be that, again, controversial.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the reasons why I got into this was because I was running, as I said, like a physical Bitcoin kiosk. So I interacted face to face with thousands of people that were using Bitcoin over the years, and I came to realize that the core value proposition that was kind of unifying everyone was this aspect of censorship resistance, and also this aspect of the immutability of the Bitcoin supply. So these two things are not properties of the code, as I had begun to understand. They were emergent properties of people running nodes and enforcing the rules themselves. So the first thing was I realized that almost nobody, none of my clients, none of my users, nobody was really complaining about the fees at that time. Everybody was already excited and talking about Lightning Network. This was something that everybody was talking about. I had also started to do some Bitcoin consulting with institutions, and the activation of SegWit and what it meant was definitely one of the big selling points of Bitcoin. So the first things that we noticed was that almost no one was running a node, and almost no one is running a node today. I think about 0.3% of the Bitcoin users run nodes, so about like 70,000 nodes or something like that. And none of these people had a say in Bitcoin, and it wasn't such a big deal because when they bought Bitcoin, they bought into an existing set of rules, and they didn't want to change the rules at all. Like, they were perfectly happy with the rules that we had. And also, I know a lot of the Bitcoin users that were my clients were like buying Bitcoin and huddling and had no idea what a node was. They're not on Twitter, they're not on Facebook. You can't, like, these people will not update, right? They're not going to update their software. They have no idea to update. So all of these people were going to be made incompatible with Node2x, which is one of the big reasons why I was against Node2x. But also, like, none of these people were able to voice any sort of opinion in terms of SegWit, right? So we try to get people to run the nodes and to enforce their own consensus rules. Because, you know, if you're not running a node, you're not a user of Bitcoin. You're an owner of Bitcoin. You may have private keys, but you're not an actual user. You're not validating it. And ultimately, if you're not running a node, then there isn't really a point in using Bitcoin. And I think that's what UASF showed. For the first time, you know, running a node is like kind of like, you know, like a condom. Like, you'd rather have one and not need one than need one and not have one. And UASF was like the first time where I personally was not running a node to validate my own transactions before UASF. And it was the first time that there was this actual need to voice your opinion. So I think it was a big education opportunity for the public to realize, like, what is the use and power of running a full node. Yeah,
and you made your node public, and I was traveling a lot, and I was using your node.
Yeah. So that was difficult. So we were running a payment processing service, which was signaling for UASF, and we were very strict about it, saying that if you're not gonna send us SegWit coins, we're just not gonna accept your payments. So we were gonna be UASF only. This was very difficult. More on that this afternoon on my topic, but there was not a lot of tools out there for UASF node operators, almost none. So we had to build our own block explorers for the UASF chain. which was quite difficult. Samurai was integrating it. And just for the record, I found my old UASF node when I was cleaning my laptop like a few weeks ago, and it's still compatible.
Awesome. And John, you were very active on Twitter and other social media. You were very famous for getting Roger Ver after, I don't remember when it was in regards to the user-activated soft fork. That went pretty much viral across the space. How do you remember the whole transition through the user-activated soft fork to get a SegWit?
Well, since this is Understanding Bitcoin, I'm going to try to do a quick overview of how everything played out as I saw it. We had SegWit. SegWit was increased efficiency for Bitcoin in general, and SegWit also was doing a fix for things like malleability of transactions, etc. For some reason, there's no one true answer that we know. There were people opposed to this. The mistake made, I think, initially was the activation method chosen for SegWit to be activated. It put too much power in the hands of the miners, and so this caused political tension. What happened was we made UASF, and UASF was basically a way for the nodes to express themselves and say, miners, we only want these kinds of blocks, and if you don't give us these kinds of blocks, your blocks will be rejected. This helped clearly define for Bitcoiners, probably for the first time for most of us, the actual roles of a miner and the roles of nodes, and where nodes are demanding blocks from miners and miners are supplying blocks and nothing more. Every actor in the Bitcoin space only has control over themselves within Bitcoin, and that's the way that it should be. But it is a marketplace, and if the market decides that it wants a certain kind of blocks with new rules, added rules, then the miners have to capitulate. And UASF never actually had to activate. They capitulated before because they knew that if they let it actually happen, there would be chaos for themselves. So as a result, we got arguments, we got the New York Agreement. I remember when Barry first announced it through DCG, I think, and I remember harassing him on Twitter immediately, and him having to take a break for a while from Twitter.
Yeah, me too.
Then there was the interview with Vinnie Lingham that I did, and that was a really good overview of the whole situation and a really good perspective into the minds of the people that supported the New York Agreement. And that was a good chance we had to refute him. And then, of course, the Roger Ver interview, where that was more about Bitcoin Cash than it was about UASF. But Bitcoin Cash arguably happened because of all of this. It probably would have happened anyway. It's a good scam. But in the end, they used the UASF, they used SegWit as an excuse to make it happen.
All right, so you guys said a couple of things I want to expand upon, and one of them was the high fees caused by the spam attack. And whenever I say it's a spam attack, people are like, no, how can you prove that? And my answer to them is, I can't prove it, because back in 2013, I decided to put a few Bitcoin into cold storage and not touch it for 10 years. Now, I got greedy because of Bcash, and I wanted to pull my 10% out the first week. So I had to go into a private key that I had no intention of using. It was actually sitting on a full node from 2013. It was on the Bitcoin client that I kind of, on an old computer. I had to, download the whole blockchain. Again, I put in the private key. And I'm like, wait a minute, why are there 3 transactions in this wallet? Because there should have been only one. I created one public key, moved a few Bitcoin in there, never touched it again since 2013. The system must have saw that as dead coins because they've been there, not touched for 4 years. And they had 2 additional transactions. Those 2 transactions were for 1 Satoshi a piece inputs that were heavy as hell. I had to scroll forever to see all the inputs. So it was clearly a spam attack onto wallets that weren't really being used. And even to this day, people are still saying how Bitcoin is slow and expensive and the fees are high, and those fees are going to go high again. How did you guys see that? And it was so frustrating to argue against it. I don't know, go ahead, you start, Slush. Because you guys were dealing with this with the pool and processing the blocks. How did that whole process go?
Yeah, this problem has probably many causes. I don't know if it was some long-term spam attack going there. I really don't know, and I never investigated this. But there's many other issues like fee estimation algorithms, which didn't work very well. They were really naive, and it's better now, but it's not still really solved. And we can see it just now, like 3 days ago, when the price pumped $1,000 per Bitcoin, the mempool get full. The fees were higher again. So the issue with spamming and with block size was probably caused by many reasons altogether, and we trying to improve the user experience in Trezor back then, because we were hit by the backlog because we supported the users. And well, actually, the rising the block size would be the quite good hotfix back then. So the users were asking us why we are against this. And there's really no good solution for the fee and spam protection. So I actually don't have any particular answer for this.
Yeah, well, James, you were running about lots of miners, and right now you're in the payment ATM space. So how did you see those high fees? How did you manage them, and do you think they can come back?
So I would say the best way to manage these sorts of high fee situations is using replace by fee, largely because it's very difficult to build accurate fee estimations when the fees needed to get a transaction mined can change rather quickly, depending on, say, just normal luck from miners, because you'll occasionally see it take even, say, an hour for a block to get mined, and that's just due to the distribution of blocks, of how often blocks get mined, because it's essentially a random process. So replace by fee, essentially, for anyone not familiar with it, allows you to increase the fee of a transaction that has already been broadcast to the network. And this allows, in the event that there's a significant spike in the fee required to get a transaction to confirm quickly, it gives you the opportunity to increase your fee if you need that extra priority. On the other hand, it also lets you reduce the fees needed if, say, for instance, you can wait a day or even a few days for a transaction to confirm. You can send it with a very low fee, and then, if necessary, at a later point, you can then increase the fee. Basically, a big part of the issue is that wallets don't really handle this properly yet, for the most part. I think there's a few wallets that have replaced by fee. Often, in some wallets, called just a bump fee option, I believe. But it's not widely implemented. And even in those cases where it is implemented, there's not really a good automated fee bump. You usually have to do it manually. So you have to watch your transaction, see if it's confirming or not, and then bump the fee if necessary. And one nice thing with replace by fee is it also lets miners gain more transaction fees potentially versus just holding on to a low fee transaction indefinitely. It allows basically it allows transactions to keep processing reliably, even in the event of a significant and rapid fee spike event.
All right, Francis, John, you guys have comments about the fees and what are I don't think they're gonna come back anything like that because it's now so expensive to do that again. What were your thoughts?
Well, the first thing is I definitely think there was a spam attack. I'm not the best blockchain analyst, but I do dabble. And I did read the research made by Laurent MT. I don't know his full name, which pointed to a single person spamming the blockchain. And you know, there's good reason to believe that, for example, this person had a Quadriga account. So we did a lot of analysis showing that there was one entity doing all that spam. And at that time, it was easier than today to do a spam attack, right? So as Slush said, and as James also said, the services and the wallets have really terrible fee calculation algorithms. And basically, they'll just kind of follow the market price of the fees kind of blindly in order to get their transactions really quickly out. So the attacker only didn't have to pay for all of those like high fees himself. He only had to kind of kickstart or catalyze this rapid increase in fees, which is arguably much more difficult to do today because now systems are much more dynamic and reactive. I mean, mine are. I'm not sure about the other companies. So the second thing also to realize was all of the big services that are doing a lot of transactions, such as like blockchain.info, Coinbase, a lot of the exchanges, a lot of the hosted wallets, they had surprisingly like pretty bad, or so it seemed, Bitcoin engineering, which is kind of weird for like a Bitcoin company. You would expect a Bitcoin company's sole focus or main focus to be on its Bitcoin engineering. And one of the problems with fees is that you have these companies that are kind of subsidized in some way. Either it's venture capital money or it's the really high fees that they get from all their trading activities. And they don't really mind like paying a high fee that much. They have a lot of bandwidth and that imposes a cost on the other users. And of course the market is gonna stabilize, but the feedback loop of the market is quite long. So the end users kind of get the externality of those people that are subsidized and that don't really care about paying high fees. The fee situation was, I mean, to me was definitely like a false flag attack. And talking about what you said, like the activation method of SegWit being the mistake. I mean, everybody wants to control Bitcoin. Everybody wants to change the rules of Bitcoin to benefit them. Even probably each of us, like deep down inside, we wish we could have more control over Bitcoin. It's just a normal thing. And if you give an inch, a slight inch, for example, when we're talking about SegWit activation, I mean, the miners weren't signaling, do I want SegWit or not? They were supposed to be signaling, am I ready for SegWit or not? Because we want everybody to activate at the same time when we're ready. It's just like a courtesy, right, to the miners. It's like, hey guys, like we're gonna let you tell us when you guys are ready, so that when you guys are ready, we'll activate, right? And just that, they used it politically to have leverage in order to increase the block size. So one of the lessons learned is that any inch you give in governance whatsoever will turn into politics. So are we going to see another spam attack? I think not, because I don't think there's a lot of interest. Well, we might, but there's not a lot of interest by the other coins, I think, to just attack Bitcoin on the fee situation. And, another comment on the fees is also they're denominated in Bitcoin. And all our costs are in, most of our costs are in USD. So obviously, when the price of Bitcoin went to like 20 grand, I mean, I personally paid $1,000 fee. There was, like maybe 270 inputs in that transaction, but I paid $1,000 fee. And the thing is, like, the fees are going to come back for sure. They might not come back as a spam attack, but they're definitely gonna increase over time. We need to be aware of that fact. So when Satoshi decided on the inflation schedule, he did a trade-off, and that trade-off was more subsidies in the beginning with really large 50 Bitcoin blocks in order to bootstrap the network early on. And he didn't give us a lot of time to scale Bitcoin. That's probably the only thing I have to say against Satoshi is that he didn't give us, I mean, 85% of Bitcoins, I think, or something, have already been mined after 10 years. So that's not a lot of time to scale the network. Yeah, so the fees are what make Bitcoin secure and censorship resistant and anonymous. It's what allows the miners to prioritize transactions without knowing who the transactions are coming from. It's essential to the system. It's essential to the long-term sustainability. And yeah, there's not much to say about the fees. The fees are a market phenomenon. The only thing that we can say about them is the market takes a long time to readjust. And the main problem I see with fees is not really their rise over time. That's expected. It's the volatility in fees that are changing wildly from a moment to the next. You know, you can have 20 Satoshi per byte yesterday and 150 Satoshi per byte a few days later. That's very difficult for users to kind of comprehend and for services to wrap their head around. It's also very difficult for Lightning. So I don't think the fee rising is a problem. I think it's like those spikes in volatility of the fees, which are the main issue. But again, when we bought Bitcoin, we all knew that the system was going to get paid for by fees. Like what happens after the Bitcoins run out? The fees. And Bitcoins run out much faster than people think, right? So we're going to be at 95% of all Bitcoin mines in a decade. So we definitely need to prepare, and this is why we needed SegWit, and this is why we need Lightning, and this is why we need to work on it, because it's happening whether or not we want it.
Yeah, no, definitely some good sound bites there. You want to add something real quick, James, and then we go to John?
Yeah. So one thing I should probably mention is essentially that a lot of services had trouble with the fee spiking because they were accepting zero confirmation transactions. And one thing is that in order to accept zero conf, you have to essentially be able to get a reasonable confidence that a particular transaction will confirm in a particular amount of time. But when you have highly volatile fee markets, essentially, basically that's not going to work reliably, and it becomes much easier to defraud a merchant via double spend attacks. Now, this is something that basically is no longer really done for the most part. ZeroConf is basically dead at this point, and I think it's actually been dead in the practical sense in terms of being able to be used. I mean, it's even when the fees weren't spiking, it wasn't very reliable. You could still pull off double spends if you knew what you were doing. I think Peter Todd, for instance, did some demonstrations on this. So that was one, I believe, political motivation for basically going to this very large or even essentially unlimited block sizes, that it would allow business models dependent on zero confirmation reliability to be viable, essentially, which I believe most developers have always considered it to be essentially a dead end, that you don't have a confirmation, it's not confirmed, essentially. But that was essentially a way for some services to offer instant payments, retail payments, before advent of layer 2 technologies like Lightning Network that can actually do secure instant transactions. So I think at this point, services now, if they need instant transaction confirmations, they now are going to go to these new solutions such as Lightning Network. Yeah.
All right, yeah, John, let's head over to you. What lessons do you think the Bitcoin ecosystem learned from that fee attack?
Well, with spam, I think to talk about it properly, you have to understand what you mean by spam and actually understand how Bitcoin is designed properly. The perspective that some people have is that there is no such thing as spam. You pay the fee, you get in. Now that you can get much subtler and more reasonable and say spam is something like UTXO pollution, basically making these little tiny transactions that somebody will have to pay for later to be able to output. In the end, we have spam. We have Veriblock right now spamming the network. Spam is just a usage of the network that is unsustainable. But you have to zoom out and you have to understand that this is only coming from a perspective of thinking that we can use Bitcoin in ways that really we can only use while it's small. Theoretically, in the end, all blocks can be full at any moment, because if they're extremely cheap to fill, they will fill and should be full. And that is the design of Bitcoin. So spam is just from the perspective of right now we're privileged that we can have very cheap transactions and that blocks aren't full. But eventually, things like Veriblock will come and fill the blocks, so they won't be spam. And so you have to say, what is the real solution? It's not complaining about spam. It's not worrying about, you know, dust attacks and things like this. It's worrying about what Bitcoin looks like when it's at full usage. And the actual solution is the Lightning Network. You want to do zero-conf properly, use the Lightning Network. You want to worry about spam, fill the blocks, and make them get on Lightning, you know?
Yeah, and one thing I can add with transaction fees also, I had this thought and discussion, you know, people compare the fees of Bitcoin to the fees of other payment processors like PayPal or Visa, and they'll say, you know, a Visa transaction costs $3 for $100. Bitcoin, you know, it costs me $4. It's more expensive than Visa. Well, you know, is the Bitcoin blockchain really a substitute for payment processors? I mean, right now it is, as you say. We're privileged to use it as such, but you know, maybe it was designed as such. I don't know, but it's not going to be this use case forever. One thing that we can compare the Bitcoin blockchain to is the judicial system, right? A judge, a notary, a court of law. When you're doing a Lightning Network transaction, or where you're on a sidechain, or when you're using a smart contract, you use Bitcoin as the arbiter in case something goes wrong, as the execution mechanism of last resort to resolve an issue, right? So in Lightning, if one of the peers goes missing or something, you can always refer to the Bitcoin blockchain in order to solve that issue you have with someone. So for sure, I mean, in 100 years, we're going to have the equivalent of, you know, maybe a $1,000 transaction fee for each transaction. But what are those transaction fees going to be able to accomplish? Well, you know, one transaction might be the fee that's paid by 10,000 people, and that fee is the fee that they're willing to pay in order to have a censorship-resistant, decentralized dispute resolution mechanism between them. And you know, as far as I'm concerned, like the dispute resolution mechanism of Bitcoin is much more efficient, much more robust, much more reliable than any court of law. And people pay a lot more right now in court of laws in order to get their contracts executed than they do with Bitcoin. So let's not compare like Bitcoin fees to payment processing fees. And just a side note, as the fees get more expensive over time, we need to, as you guys said, talk about these RBF solutions, child pay for parent solution. And another problem I think we might see happening is transactions that get lost and delisted from the mempool and that are lost forever. I'll just give you an example. Let's say that you're moving Bitcoins from one wallet to another, and then you send Bitcoin from Bitcoin Core on your laptop. You think you're all good. The fees don't look too high. You wipe off your Bitcoin Core from your computer, thinking it's going to go to another node, and then that transaction is dropped from the mempool, and you lost it forever. So if you don't want that to happen to you, you might as well want to take like a snapshot of your mempool just to make sure it doesn't happen. But yeah, there's going to be all sorts of UX issues around the fees, but they're the same issues that we've seen with security and privacy. Every problem in Bitcoin is an entrepreneurial opportunity. The demand for sound money is very, very large, and it's going to keep growing. And anybody that wants to use sound money in some way is going to want to use whichever service is able to give them the most bang for their buck. So it's just another thing that we're going to have to do. I mean, once we build Bitcoin, it would be kind of boring if we didn't do anything, if there were no problems left. So every problem is just an opportunity to work on, you know, creative solutions.
Yeah, what Bitcoiners and eventually the entire blockchain world has to come to terms with is that Bitcoin is a settlement network. It's the best place to store value. It ultimately, as a base layer, it's not designed optimally to be able to be something that covers everything. Instant transactions, frequent transactions, cheap transactions. We can do this on second layers. We can focus on Bitcoin being a settlement layer and the highest security place to store value in the world. And then we can build everything on top of that.
Yeah. This may be related. Back then, when the user base of Bitcoin were rising quite fast, a lot of people didn't understand actually how Bitcoin and UTXO system works. So part of the spam could be just misused by normal users. Like we were having many issues with miners sending tons of payouts to their wallets, and they were surprised why they should pay $1,000 for sending out $1,000, and they were blaming Bitcoin and the whole system. So I think this improved a lot. Because people were pressed to understand more how it works, how to optimize the fee, but I'm pretty sure, based on the feedback with like the tens or 100,000 users on Trezor, that a lot of these issues were caused by misunderstanding how everything works.
Mm-hmm.
Check. I definitely agree, because I remember in the early days, the way that people promoted Bitcoin. Well, this is kind of what happened with Roger Ver. He never stopped promoting Bitcoin the way we all used to by mistake. And what we used to say was that Bitcoin was anonymous, Bitcoin was cheap, Bitcoin was fast. But really, Bitcoin is not really any of those things. It's pretty much the opposite. And we always thought they were those things because we were ignorant and we didn't understand Bitcoin yet, and we were using Bitcoin in those ways, and we thought it was okay. And then, there are some people that never let that go, and so they're trying to recreate that dream in Bitcoin Cash and things like this.
So let's, we have about 5 more minutes. Let's quickly talk about that part, right? So what do you guys think are the lessons learned from those trying to fork off the network, thinking they can do a better Bitcoin? So just continue on with where you're going, John.
I mean, honestly, the first thing that comes to mind as lesson learned is that it's a pretty damn good scam. New people coming into the space, we were that way when we were new. We believed those stories, so it's a great story to tell a new person. This Bitcoin is faster, this Bitcoin is cheaper, this Bitcoin is more efficient, this Bitcoin is for the people, it's cash, it's peer-to-peer. It's all bullshit. But it's exactly what you want to hear when you're new. So it's a really great scam. Unfortunately, it's not Bitcoin. In the end, every altcoin is just offering a lower security model than Bitcoin and a higher risk. This can be okay in certain situations if I'm just trying to transfer money really quickly and you're trying to sell it as soon as you receive it for some other money, but that's really all they're going to be able to use it for. It's not going to replace Bitcoin. The problem with their idea is that the more they come close to being as successful as Bitcoin, the more their model will look like Bitcoin. They're going to have to keep, like, if everybody started using Bitcoin Cash, the design of Bitcoin Cash would start to resemble more and more like Bitcoin, or it won't work.
So I mean, there's a lot of lessons learned. I think as a group of people, as an industry, we started to understand what is consensus. Consensus was a very abstract thing before, and the idea of 100% consensus over the rules is really weird in a mind frame where we're either in a democracy or we're shareholder voting, or there's always some kind of group that is able to a majority that can make things move forward. And the concept of having a minority, for example, in the case of UASF, that stubbornly refuses to have a change, and all the game theory around it was definitely an educational opportunity for a lot of us. It was certainly for me. Roger Ver got me into Bitcoin in the beginning. It was definitely his videos that got me into it. And I was a libertarian. I didn't know what a cypherpunk was until UASF. I think what UASF, the big lesson of UASF and No2X was the cypherpunk ethos is the core ethics, the core value proposition of Bitcoin. The libertarian aspect of it is only a byproduct of it being. You can't have sound money. You can't have privacy and censorship resistant to transactions without having a censorship resistant layer on top. Another lesson that we learned is that miners don't decide the rules of Bitcoin. So that's really useful when you're doing a Q&A on Bitcoin with people who don't know about it, and they ask you, what would happen if the miners decide to change the rules or they decide to screw us over? Well, we now can point to a specific point in time, an actual event, No2X. It's proof. It's proof that the miners don't decide the rules. As far as I'm concerned, conceptually, the main difference between Bitcoin and, for example, Ethereum, in terms of consensus, is No2X. No2X, 2X would have happened on any other blockchain, and it didn't happen on Bitcoin. And it was it was a very defining moment for Bitcoin. In terms of that aspect of the governance. And I think the other thing that I personally learned with UASF and No2X, well, one of the things, that we learned is that the immutability, the rules of Bitcoin are not in code. It's all a social contract. Some people get upset when I say that Bitcoin is mostly in our heads, and it's mostly a concept in our heads, but it is. And the myth of immutability, or not the myth, but the idea of the immutability of the rules is so important to keep the consensus going and to keep the value going. There's no like lender of last resort in Bitcoin. There's nobody to save you. You need to absolutely have 100% confidence that things are going to stay the same and nobody can pull the rug out from under you. After No2X happened, I started to like Bitcoin again. Before UASF at the end, I mean, I think like a lot of us, I think we were kind of depressed and angry. UASF and No2X made me extremely bullish on Bitcoin's value proposition of sound money. And I think there's a lot more lessons to be learned, or that we have learned. But I think what's really important is that those lessons are kind of embedded and inherent now. I don't think anybody's going to try to pull that off again in a while. And a lot of the lessons that we learned was, for example, on the anti-fragility of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not anti-fragile by itself. People that tell me, oh, No2X would have, 2X would have never happened anyway. That upsets me because we worked pretty hard. I mean, all of us, we spent money flying to conferences. We spent a lot of time in podcasts. So the anti-fragility of Bitcoin is made by people and not by the code. So that was another big lesson. We have to be and we can't let the market decide. That's one of the things that we realize, I think, is that we are all part of the market. Like, nobody should let the market decide and then go with the majority. Just go with the rules that you want to enforce yourself and enforce them yourself. And you can talk to your peers to make sure that you end up at the right shelling point and not on a fork. But ultimately, the idea to let the market decide, which was what the big companies were pushing for, I think was absurd. And I also think that Bitcoin companies should be activists in some sense. I don't think that they should be neutral in any way, or they should, I think they should really make a conscious activism effort. And because if the Bitcoin companies and the Bitcoin influencers, which are CEOs mostly and people that work in companies, they don't do this kind of activism, then there is no white cell in Bitcoin, right? So the white cells are people. Being toxic on Twitter, being loud, and getting it up in people's face. That's how we protect Bitcoin. So it's Bitcoin works like that. Bitcoin is made of people in the end.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. We have maybe 5 more minutes. We do have a side mic right there. If anyone has a question, just come up to the mic. I see Austin in the back. So we'll take one audience question, and then we'll hand it off to the next panel on not your keys, not your Bitcoin.
I want to bring up a quick funny lesson to suspend the topic lately, which is people worrying about whether or not the fee market will be enough to sustain miners. Well, the funny thing is this happens to be the only rule miners do have control over. They can decide what fees of transactions are to let transactions in. It's not a real problem.
Is that on? I'll give you mine. Oh, yeah, one going.
So lately we hear some about Snore and that it would make transactions more efficient and help with block weight. But I don't know much about it. Can you give some kind of basics of what the effect of like Snore activation would be on block weight?
Yeah, I think we're going to have a panel on that tomorrow as well. But yeah, go ahead. If someone can talk about like how easy is it going to be? Like from the lessons learned of the user-activated soft fork, do you see challenges in activating Schnorr?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's kind of a different question. But yeah, I think one of the things that I like about Bitcoin in terms of development philosophy is that you want to put as less data as you can on the blockchain. You want to make your proofs as more compact as possible, and ultimately the blockchain is just a timestamp of those proofs. And if you can reduce the amount of data that you can put in a block, it's much better than increase the size of block. It's much harder to do that than increasing the block size is easy. In terms of Schnorr, I mean, So the Schnorr proposal is out. I don't think. No, sorry. The Schnorr proposal is not out. I don't think there's an activation mechanism that's been decided yet, and that's probably going to be the most exciting thing in Bitcoin, going forward. Is as John said, we kind of screwed up the first time with the miner signaling activation. UASF was kind of a cluster. Let's not do the same kind of UASF that we did for BIP 148. I think there's a few nice proposals out there. We'll see who opposes Schnorr, actually, because Schnorr is another thing that's not extremely controversial. It should have been in Bitcoin. I think it wasn't in Bitcoin because there was still a patent on it.
Yeah, it was a patent copyright.
Right, so Schnorr, I see Schnorr very similar to SegWit. It's something that doesn't impose, as far as I know, externality on others. So if it doesn't impose externality on others and it makes the system much better, nobody should oppose it. And we'll see who opposes it. So before, you had these big blockers and the big miners that were in Bitcoin that were trying to oppose it somehow. I think now we're probably going to see some of the altcoiner communities trying to somehow block Schnorr from happening. Schnorr is going to make a lot of efficiencies in terms of reducing the amount of signatures that you need in a transaction. Is going to make Bitcoin much better. So it'll just be interesting to see who opposes it. But I think it's going to, the lesson of UASF and No2X is still very fresh in people's minds. And again, it's just like SegWit, so I think our chances are pretty good.
Quick comment.
I don't agree that the reason that something is not controversial is the reason it will be activated, like SegWit. And this is my lesson learned, that we are responsible to spreading the knowledge, because a lot of misunderstanding was because everything was too technical and too untransparent for standard non-technical people. So it was easy to push some bullshits around SegWit, which was the reason why so many people were afraid of this and against of this. So I think one lesson learned is to avoid such misunderstanding. And I believe that Schnorr will be a much better case because we already learned something. And another point is that we should work towards more decentralization. So there won't be a single entity to be able to block improvements like this. And I think guys from Slush Pool will talk tomorrow about some possible steps how to decentralize the mining itself.
And one thing I would add is that throughout these, for instance, SegWit activation, there was a big disconnect in a lot of companies between their engineering side and their more business side. And I think overall that a lot of companies were not, the CEOs and the business executives were not listening to their engineering teams. Because it was a very common pattern to see, even in China, even with the miners. It was very common where the engineering teams would be opposed to the 2x hard fork and support SegWit, but the executives of the company would have a different opinion. So it wasn't even a matter of that the executives weren't trusting outside developers. They weren't even trusting their own engineering teams to make accurate assessments on, or just taking advice from their engineering teams when it comes to which technology and which way forward is going to be the most viable. It was, yeah, they were, it was definitely a case of the executives would listen to, for instance, other business executives over their own internal engineering teams.
All right. I think this is related to what I said on the beginning, that some questions don't have simple answers, and we had many questions why we don't support just simple block size increase, and we were not able to give any quick management answer for this, because it's much more technical. You have to think in sustainable way, which is not how businesses or users think. Like they want simple answers, and yeah.
I think one of the challenges we have is to be good stewards of Bitcoin. And that means that finding ways to properly give elevator speeches about the complicated things. Like right now, we had somebody ask about Schnorr signatures, and we gave him theoretical answers about what may happen with activation, but we didn't tell him anything about how it works. And so we have to make sure that when we introduce new technologies and new features into Bitcoin, that we're not just further separating, you know, the plebs from the wizards, and everything becomes this magic spell that gets cast that we don't understand, and we just have to be fully reliant on trust. There has to be some understanding of how these things work, and we have to make sure people like us make an effort to have ways of translating the technical aspects into understandable concepts to people.
Yeah, and my final comment will be, I think we all know how difficult that is. Hence why we should maintain backwards compatibility almost at all costs. It's one of the best features of Bitcoin. And if it's hard, imagine how hard it is to get people educated about a soft fork that is still backwards compatible. Imagine how incredibly difficult it would be to get every single Bitcoin user not only to reach out to them and find out who they are, because we don't know who they are, and explain it to them and convince them, and also get them to update and upgrade a new Bitcoin core node, which they're not running now. It would be incredibly difficult. So if it's extremely difficult with a soft fork, it's nearly impossible to do with a hard fork. So whatever we do going forward, I hope that in activation methods, we have backwards compatibility as the highest priority.
All right. Thank you so much, guys. This was an excellent panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.